the prestigious EAAMO' Prize for her contributions to the digital and computational demography, which is like a prize for rising stars in academia. And we're super honored to have her here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for having me. I have to admit that this is my first time attending EAAMO', but I'm already very excited, and I'm very excited also to have conversations beyond sort of the usual networks that I interact with. So please do reach out and connect, and I'd love to learn more about what you're doing, and also just maybe find common shared interests and conversations. So as Celestine said, I'm really a demographer. I'm a population scientist. I'm very interested in questions about population dynamics, about mortality, population health, family, migration. And a core underlying theme in a lot of my research is that I really care about questions about gender inequalities, broadly across global context, but I'm also very interested in gender inequalities, especially in low-middle income countries. And in the last 5 or maybe 7 years, I've become really interested in the question of what does the digital revolution really mean for global gender inequalities? But the question can even be broader, right? What does sort of digitalization and the digitalization of our societies really mean for inequalities at large, and for access to resources for marginalized communities and groups? Is it okay if I leave it like this? Or is it better if I hold it?
That should be okay.
Right. I assume you can still hear me. Great. So, as I said, one of the questions that I've become very interested in the last 7 years has been this the impacts of digitalization. And what I said is the digital revolution. So what do I really mean by the digital revolution? Well, that's what's shown in this graph on the slide, which shows you technology subscriptions per capita, so cellular and fixed and mobile internet technologies across the world from roughly the 1990s till 2017. And you see this sort of rapid proliferation of mobile phones and the internet. If we think about it, really in the last 20 odd years, so it's been extremely short in terms of the decadal time frame in which this diffusion has taken place. But as you can see from the speed of this diffusion, it's been extraordinarily rapid. And this is really a global process. This is all regions of the world, the same technology subscriptions per capita. And what we see is that there is no region of the world that has been unaffected. Of course, the levels of the diffusion of technologies varies across regions, but the diffusion process looks very similar everywhere. In fact, if we look particularly at Africa and also in Asia, we see that the blue bars, which correspond, is non-existent really. And that shows that mobile has been the first large-scale telecommunication infrastructure that has prevailed across these regional contexts. So mobile has been really a very, very novel technology in some cases, even as it relates to just telecommunication. And then we see, of course, the black bars here, mobile internet, from corresponding to the period roughly after 2005. And we see that has also really taken off. In fact, it's been even faster than fixed internet. So created a second internet boom, especially in the context of low and middle income countries. So the starting point for my talk today is the idea that this digital revolution is clearly a sort of social transformation or a social revolution. And this idea that technology has the potential to empower populations, particularly marginalized populations, because it provides easier access to information, better connectivity, and access to vital services and goods in more sort of potentially democratic and also more cost-effective ways, is something that actually lies at the heart of a very prominent framework for thinking about global development, which is the UN's Sustainable Development Goals.
the SDGs, across multiple SDGs, talk about this potential of technologies to empower marginalized populations. And SDG 5, which is on gender equality, explicitly pledges to enhance the use of information and communication technologies to promote the empowerment of women. So this is a pledge, and this is an idea in SDG 5. And one of the things that initially brought me to this line of research was that I saw across multiple SDGs, this is SDG 5, but also SDG 4 on education, SDGs on reducing inequalities, all in different ways talk about technologies in them, right? And I was very curious about, well, is there really empirical evidence for this? So this is clearly is something that is envisioned, and theoretically we can imagine there's potential, but is this really happening? So it's an empirical question. And if you know any demographers, as your friends or your colleagues, you know that we're very data-driven, very interested in sort of empirical analysis to ask questions about such kinds of things. But the other element that I think is interesting for social scientists, computer scientists, and others interested in studying social processes at large is that, of course, the diffusion of technologies themselves, internet and mobile technologies, has created new streams of data, non-traditional from a social perspective data sources, that also have the potential for real-time monitoring on sustainable development goals and processes. And this is again recognized in a number of policy documents within the Global Sustainable Development Agenda. In fact, there is a whole report on mobilizing the data revolution for sustainable development, which was issued in 2014, that talks quite extensively about the importance of leveraging new digital trace and other web, social media, mobile data sources for closing the data gaps that exist. So again, from a broader perspective, I think the question to ask is, okay, if there is this potential, is it being realized, or how can it be realized? And also, how can we do it in a way that helps us understand social processes, but also makes us, or that we're sure that we're actually capturing real things, that the measure that we get from using these data sources are actually meaningful and unbiased. And this brings me to sort of what I want to talk about in my talk today, which is the Digital Gender Gaps Project. And the Digital Gender Gaps Project is a collaboration that I've been leading for the last few years, which is a team of social scientists and computer scientists in which we're seeking to build and deepen data and evidence on the impacts of digital information and capabilities, particularly on women's economic and social empowerment in low and middle income countries, by leveraging different types of quasi-experimental designs and through the geospatial augmentation of largely large-scale secondary population survey data sets, such as the demographic and health surveys, but also deepen data on gender gaps in digital connectivity at national and subnational levels, again, through integration of social media, geospatial and population and census data sets. So those are sort of the two strands. The first part is really asking the question of the social and gender impacts of digital diffusion, but also the second question is trying to use the digital revolution as data revolution to ask questions about, can we map gender gaps in digital connectivity through new kinds of data streams? So to motivate some of this work, we can actually look at social science literatures, and particularly literatures both in the demographic as well as the economic sciences that ask about technology impact. So there are some well-known papers, for example, that talk about TV and how the TV and exposure to new ideas and new behaviors on TV can actually shift how people believe about things in the world, but also how they behave. So there are these papers, for example, by Jensen and Oster, that look at cable TV and how that affects gender norms surrounding sun preference in India. There's also work by La Ferrara and colleagues that look at soap operas in Brazil and find that just greater exposure to small family sizes on soap operas can affect people's fertility preferences as well. So there's this idea that sort of, ideas diffuse through new technologies. And as I said, these papers on the TV show that. And there's also a large theoretical tradition within the social sciences that talk about how technologies can alter paths for social learning and social interaction, how we learn from each other because of the ways that we can connect in ways that new technologies can afford. So if we think specifically about mobile phones, where we've been focusing a lot of our effort, mobile phones are kind of like TV in that they can sort of provide you new information and they can show you, access to new media, but they also do something that, for example, TVs don't, which is they can give you access to private information, and they can also give you access to goods and services, for example, through health, through mobile money, which can foster financial inclusion for those who may be otherwise unbanked or not have access to traditional financial institutions. Mobile phones can also give you better connectivity, access to networks, and of course, as I said, they also can give you exposure to the life of others, particularly with smartphones, with more globalized media exposures that can transcend national boundaries in a way that often, at least traditionally, TV has not. Because a lot of TV content, at least in the past, has been sort of more nationally focused. So we first started exploring this question sort of by building a country panel data set in which we just really combined information on technology subscriptions over time at the country level with a range of other socioeconomic development indicators. And we first started purely looking at sort of macro level correlations in this kind of country panel setup, where we put in information on mobile phones and looked at outcomes of interest linked to health, mortality, gender inequality. So this is the UNDP's Gender Inequality Index, which is a measure of health, education, and labor market participation. It's a composite index. And we also looked at measures linked to sexual and reproductive health, such as the contraceptive prevalence measure. And effectively, and we put in our regression model, we looked at sort of the relationship or the association between mobile phones and these different outcomes. And then we also put in controls for educational expansion, GDP per capita, age structure, to sort of net out other processes that may also be affecting improvements over time in these outcomes. And we find that even when we put in these controls, the relationship between mobile phones and these outcomes persisted. And these associations were especially strong in Q1 and Q2 countries by GDP per capita, which is the sort of low and lower middle income countries, is where these associations were much stronger. So this you see on this graph. You also see this here for the mortality measures, maternal mortality and under 5 mortality, that really the payoffs to mobile phones in terms of this association is really strong in these Q1 and Q2 countries. So lower middle income countries is where we see these large associations net of these controls for education expansion, GDP. So it's not pure development measures, which is what these other indicators capture, but there seems to be something that mobile phones are doing to sort of spur these sustainable development processes. So then we decided to look at the micro level, at the individual level. And for this, we used the first set of questions on digital adoption that were included in the demographic and health surveys, which is a large-scale demographic survey infrastructure that has existed really since the 1990s in a range of low and middle income countries. But starting phase 7 of the DHS program, a number of questions about ownership of mobile phones and also internet use were included within the survey directly. So this was the first 7 countries on which the phase 7 measures were available on digital adoption. And in the survey, so the names of the countries, Angola, Burundi, Ethiopia, Malawi, Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, these countries are where the first set of DHS measures become available. And so we said, let's look at this and see in the DHS the relationship between mobile adoption and a range of outcomes linked to women's empowerment. So there's an empowerment module in the DHS, which asks questions about decision-making surrounding your health, your household purchases, your children's health. There are questions also about contraceptive adoption, access and awareness about antenatal health. So sort of traditional measures that have been used in the demographic literature to study sexual and reproductive health, as well as gender equality. So as we can see, we have in these 7 countries, we have different stages of mobile adoption. So that's the gray bars. But we also see that when women do, so this is using the women's questionnaire, when women do adopt mobile phones, they also use them for important things. So here we see there's a large use amongst those who are mobile owners for use in financial transactions, and also use also for receiving information about family planning. Now, a key challenge in this, asking this question about, does the adoption of mobile phones affect sexual and reproductive health knowledge or women's empowerment, is of course that those who may be more empowered are the ones who also are likely to be mobile adopters, particularly at early stages of digital diffusion. So there's what economists call an endogeneity issue. So how do we address this endogeneity issue? One of the approaches that we've used in the project has been to leverage this natural experiment, which is that where lightning strikes occur, more mobile phone towers break down. And mobile phone towers breaking down means, of course, connectivity is poorer. And for reasons outside of an individual's control, you have poorer connectivity, right? So we have essentially, we're using flash rates observed by a satellite as an instrumental variable for regressing mobile adoption in the first stage. So lightning strikes are essentially a quasi-experiment that enable us to assess the impact of mobile adoption on the outcomes that we're interested in. So this is, again, through a geospatial augmentation of the DHS, we leverage this natural experiment to assess the impact of mobile adoption on the outcomes that we're interested in. So here we see the Probit OLS panel shows us, so we, of course, just look at the correlation between mobile adoption and these outcomes of interest and put in, of course, a battery of covariates and controls. But then we also do estimate the same models, but with the lightning strikes IV, instrumental variable. And we see that for the outcomes linked to decision-making on contraception, equality, women's ability to make decisions surrounding health, large household purchases, their mobility outside the house, as well as children's health, we see continued impacts even with the instrumental variable models, decision-making and use of modern contraception, as well as knowledge about HIV testing and where to access it. We see the effects persisting even with our, even with the use of the quasi-experiment. And when we do heterogeneity analysis, we find that the payoffs of technology adoption are actually much larger in the areas of low local development. So where other infrastructure is lacking, right, we find that there are much larger payoffs of mobile adoption. So the coefficients on our models on mobile are comparable to the size of urban in most cases. So it's almost like there's mobiles are helping fill a gap when other kinds of resources, infrastructures are lacking. Now, in similar strands of work, we tried to do this to look at a range of decision-making and particularly demographic decision-making outcomes. So in other works, won't go too much into this paper, but in this paper on migration, we look at a range of countries in the Middle East, in the North Africa, an Arab region using the Arab Barometer, again, a very large scale survey infrastructure, where we look at intentions to migrate. And we look at gender differences in intention to migrate, and again, internet use and mobile use. And we find that, again, the payoffs to mobile adoption are larger, mobile and mobile internet adoption in particular, are larger amongst women and amongst those with less education. So we see here that the willingness to migrate is here amongst internet users. We see in blue, so we see that those who are using the internet more have more well-developed intentions about migration, willingness to emigrate. But then we see that the relative impact of internet adoption seems to be much larger for women and also for those with less formal education, which we read again as digital, as is for those who lack or have less access to networks, resources in other ways. That's where digital is actually having larger payoffs. So just to summarize some of this work on the social impacts of the digital revolution, this work, as well as ongoing work that we've been doing, exploring some of particularly the gender heterogeneity around digital impacts, finds that mobile phone ownership, particularly mobile internet in some cases, is linked to improved women's empowerment, reproductive and sexual health outcomes. But we find in particular these interesting heterogeneity with bigger payoffs at lower levels of economic development. So one big takeaway from all of this is that digital clearly matters, but that we actually need to see digital inequalities and track digital inequalities, particularly by gender. So a lot of these findings we have here show these big payoffs for women in particular, who are gaining from mobile phones, mobile internet. But then the question is, well, okay, then we really need to know who is adopting, and then where are there gaps in terms of digital adoption at the individual level. So as I said, I initially came to this question asking, what are the impacts of digital? And very quickly I realized when I first asked this question that there were very large data gaps about digital adoption by gender using the traditional types of data sources that social scientists use, like population surveys and censuses and so on. So many times, for example, in censuses, we have really good questions on household level adoption of digital, but we also know that household measures are not very good at capturing intra-household inequalities. Often intra-household inequalities are much larger than between household inequalities in some of the cases or in some of the country cases that we've been looking at. So what's interesting then is, well, okay, we have this data gap. So this map here shows a simple measure, which is the female to male ratio of internet use, computed using sort of surveys where we had a comparable measure across different countries. So we just wanted to see which countries can we compute this measure for, the gender gap in internet use, using a relatively recent survey. And we see there are many parts of the world where we have a data gap on this, right? We don't have a high quality or reasonably high quality nationally representative survey where we can compute this measure. So to fill this data gap, we turned to new data streams, in particular data from social media. And what our project has been doing has been developing a lot of expertise around the use of repurposing data that social media companies are providing to advertisers. They provide audience estimates, aggregate counts of monthly and daily active users to advertisers free of charge in most cases, to across actually all social media platforms in one way or another do this. And for many of them, there are also APIs, application programming interfaces, where you can query these data and store them. Just so they're aggregate counts, and this is an example here on Facebook's ad manager. I've asked, what's the estimated audience size? So what's the number of monthly active users on Facebook in Nigeria, aged 18 plus, gender women, right? So it's kind of, in some sense, giving us an aggregate count of users on the platform. As I said, you can query this using an underlying API for which you need to have a Facebook account and you need to have a marketing app. And we have a couple of tutorials that we've also written on how you can access these counts. This is also the case for, as I said, multiple platforms. So this is just what LinkedIn's ad manager looks like, which will provide similar kinds of aggregate audience estimates. And what we've been doing with this, we've had multiple different types of applications of these aggregate counts of audiences. But the thing that we've been doing on our website, digitalgendergaps.org, is we've been trying to predict internet and mobile adoption by gender. So we're getting a count here from Facebook, but our interest is not Facebook. Our interest is internet and mobile adoption at large. So we're learning from a sample of Facebook, which is one population of social media users, and we're trying to extrapolate to a sort of broader social indicator of interest, which is the internet and mobile gender gap, or adoption of internet and mobile technologies by gender. We've also done work looking at trying to predict the professional and managerial gender gaps across countries in the world using LinkedIn's ad audience estimates. But I just want to show you some maps now using the internet and mobile access gender gaps predicted using the Facebook gender gap. And our rationale for doing this, as the next couple of slides will show, is really to expand geographical coverage and also to provide more timely data, because surveys are not as high frequency as, of course, the audience estimates that we from Facebook are. And our approach is fairly simple. We compute a measure of interest from the Facebook ad audience data, which is the Facebook gender gap index, which is the female to male ratio of Facebook users divided by the female to male ratio of the population in that given country or subnational territory of interest. And then we use, or as a predictor variable in a model where our ground truth is coming from the survey. So we get a survey computed measure of the internet or the mobile gender gap, and then we use the Facebook gender gap as one variable in a prediction model to predict the internet gender gap. And we fit three types of predictive models. So our first model is just to use the most highly correlated Facebook feature, right? And we actually do find that Facebook gender gap is, across much of the world, highly correlated with the internet gender gap, a correlation of about 0.8 or 0.85. And we have, it's much stronger than any other development indicator, including the Human Development Index or any other measure, including internet penetration as well. And we fit three types. So the first simple model is just to use the most highly correlated Facebook feature, which is usually the Facebook gender gap 18+, very global, general feature. And then we have an online-offline model where we take the Facebook gender gap, and then we also use a bunch of other development-linked variables such as the Human Development Index, internet penetration, GDP per capita, and we essentially expand our feature set to consider a range of other development-linked variables. And we have an offline model where we say, well, what if we didn't have the social media measure and we just had these other development measures? How would our prediction be? And we consistently find that the best performing model is the online-offline model, but this is very closely followed by the online model and then the offline model. And the online model actually gives us the widest geographical coverage in terms of countries covered, in terms of we can make a prediction for a much larger set of countries than we can with the online-offline model. So this is what the Internet Gender Gap Index looks like predicted using the online model, the Facebook Gender Gap Index. And we find that there are large inequalities disfavoring women in internet adoption in South Asia and also in Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's something that we're able to predict every month. Essentially the model is we fit with new data every month, and that you can see on our website, digitalgendergaps.org. So this is all at the national level. What we're doing now is we're taking the same approach and trying to see if we can make these predictions at a subnational level. Because one of the things that in engaging with a number of different kinds of organizations, both in civil society as well as international development organizations within the UN, we regularly get asked, can we do this at smaller levels? Because it's fine for us to know the gender gap at the national level, but we'd really like to know in local areas, particularly when deploying interventions linked to specific kinds of apps or finding about interventions, mobile interventions. We'd like to know where we'll reach women more, where we'll reach women less. These are the kinds of questions that really require us to go below the national level. And that's what we're trying to do at the moment. We're trying to build these subnational maps of digital gender gaps. And here again, we have survey-based measures, which you can see from the demographic and health surveys, which are available for some parts of the African continent, but then but using the Facebook gender gap and Facebook gender gap linked measures, we can expand coverage to essentially the whole of the African continent, with some exceptions. But the clear correspondence between the two measures for where the Facebook and the DHS data are available show that the model is performing reasonably well, although we're still tweaking it, and we're trying to understand how we can improve it by also incorporating other kinds of features into the model. So just to show a couple of applications as well moving forward. So on digitalgendergaps.org, because we've had the website running now for over 5 years, we're looking at also places where the digital gender gap in internet adoption and mobile adoption is closing. On average, we find that mobile adoption gender gaps are closing faster than internet gender gaps are. And we also find that in most of the African continent where we have large gender gaps disfavoring women, we do see closing trends, i.e. the gender gap is becoming smaller, but we also find that the levels of the gender gap still remain pretty large in the magnitude of a female to male ratio of 0.65 to 0.7, right? So there's still a large gap to close. Similarly, we see the same trends in India for closing of the gender gap, but again, the magnitude of the gender gap still remains in the order of magnitude of about 0.65 and has gone from 0.65 to 0.67 during this time that we've been monitoring it. We found some interesting developments in Afghanistan during the fall of Kabul on our collection system. So here I'm not showing the internet gender gap, but showing daily active users on Facebook. And the black line here corresponds to the daily active users in thousands, and the green line here corresponds to the female to male ratio of daily active users who are 15 to 19, so adolescents in Afghanistan. And we see that in particular around the beginning of the Taliban offensive and the period between the beginning of the Taliban offensive and the fall of Kabul in 2021, we see that there was a marked increase in adolescent girls engaging on social media on a daily basis. And our system, because we collect these data every day, was able to track this as it was happening. There were a number of prominent social media campaigns, such as "Don't Touch My Clothes," that occurred during this time, and we saw this marked uptick. And it's interesting because we sort of see this as a form of there's greater and greater offline seclusion, and we see instead online protest that this data stream was picking up as these events unfolded. And so, as I said, we see girls over this period become a larger share of adolescent or teenage Facebook users. So on the one hand, our system on digital gender gaps allows us to monitor events such as this or look at trends in the digital gender gap over time, and also to map subnational variation. So it enables us to measure this population inequality, which is quite, I think, important and interesting and relevant for the broader SDG framework. But monitoring digital gender gaps is also interesting because they can help us illuminate biases in other kinds of analysis using online samples or online populations. And this is just to give you one such example. In the work that we've done looking at global professional gender gaps, modeled using LinkedIn gender gaps, again, using the same advertising audience estimates, we find that in countries where women are less likely to be online, so there are large digital gender gaps disfavoring women, the LinkedIn gender gaps generally tend to over-predict professional gender equality. So we're picking up in these contexts where there are large digital gender gaps, we're picking up a sort of very selected online population, which also then helps us to understand the biases of other predictions we make from other specific types of platforms here in the case of LinkedIn. So we're using LinkedIn here to predict ILO, International Labour Organization-based, survey-based measures of the professional gender gap. And we can sort of use the digital gender gap to then try and correct our bias of this LinkedIn-based prediction. So just to summarize, a lot of our work in the Digital Gender Gaps project, but a lot of my work more broadly is interested in this question of what does the digital revolution mean in terms of its social impacts, but also in terms of its data impacts for measuring population and sustainable development outcomes and processes. And this work is part of an effort to sort of deepen empirical evidence on the impacts of digital technologies on gender inequalities linked to SDG 5. But this work also shows that digital gender gaps still remain and they persist. And because of the importance of digital, as this work shows, it's more important than ever to track digital inequalities by demographic characteristics, such as gender, but also age, and of course other characteristics. But a lot of traditional survey and census data sets that social scientists such as myself use are not capturing these measures, at least at the individual level. So I think that's a really important data gap that we should be looking to fill. To fill this data gap, we have for the moment been using these social media marketing data streams, and this is one way that we've tried to fill this gap for the moment. But even for this work, we're still relying on high quality survey data sets, right? Because we need to validate and train our models. So the best use of new kinds of data in our case is also one that leverages the complementarities of both new and traditional forms of social data. And I think that is very important to acknowledge here, that we really still need both the old and the new in a diversifying data ecosystem. And as I tried to illustrate in the last example, these demographic analyses of digital inequalities are interesting to measure in of themselves and important for illuminating population inequalities, but they're also very relevant for helping us understand biases more broadly on analyses of online populations. I think the computer wants me to stop, and I will. And thank you very much for your attention.
Well, we can start.
So thank you, Ridhi, for like the great talk. I think we can start with a few questions. Sure. Yeah. Who wants? Yeah, please go ahead. I'll just repeat the question.
Okay, sure. So first, thank you for the talk, very. Okay. Yeah, so thank you for the talk. Like very interesting insights. And like definitely a lot of model development and like the analysis. So far you could argue that you've painted a very constant picture of increased internet adoption, especially as far as gender inequality and like increased development and access to resources, particularly in the global south. But I was wondering, and perhaps like some of your concluding thoughts were touching on this. How do you consider, or is there future work to analyze maybe some of the negative impacts of the increased digital adoption, such as increasing gender-based violence or harassment, or decreases in mental health and stability?
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent question. So, I think there are sort of 2 points that I want to make. So first is that some of the work that I presented today is sort of showing these positive impacts, but we also have examples where we don't have, or at least from a gender perspective, we don't see the positive benefits accruing to women and girls. So just to give you one example of an ongoing paper that we're working on, we look at the distribution of free laptops to adolescents in senior secondary school through a laptop distribution program that was implemented in India, we find that even though the laptops were handed out to rural school children, really boys only see improvements in learning outcomes, and we see that the boys, and we see also reductions in sort of private out-of-school tuition, but the girls don't. But the girls anyway had less tuition before, or had less access to it, and then they also don't see improvements in learning outcomes, and we interpret this as a case of either there's a sense of, oh, girls don't need this, or there's a, so families are sort of either selling that on the secondary market or probably giving this on to younger brothers or others within the household. So we shouldn't expect there to be sort of unilaterally positive impacts in all cases. They're very much shaped by also normative context, and that's actually part of the reason why we're trying to do this work in a comparative way. You also see where it happens and where it works out differently. But your point, I think, completely. Actually, another example I want to give is where we looked at the mobile internet use, and we looked at attitudes, gender attitudes in particular, using again the Afrobarometer, and we found that for women, mobile users linked to more progressive gender attitudes, particularly surrounding women assuming leadership roles. But for men, we found null impacts, and in some cases even negative impacts, right? So again, globalized media can mean also access to media narratives that are not always liberal or progressive, in fact, quite the contrary. And I think part of our effort within this project is to understand who, under what conditions, and the different types of heterogeneity that we see towards building a sort of broader set of theories around understanding mechanisms of change, but also mechanisms in which we can see reversions of stalls. But I think the reason why I sort of try and first paint a positive picture, particularly when I'm trying to make this argument to those who run large-scale surveys, is to say, well, we actually need to be able to measure these things better first, and we can't because a lot of digital measures aren't even being included in key data infrastructure that social scientists are using. Your point is very well taken. I don't think we should. In fact, they're theoretically ambiguous effects, and I think it's quite interesting for us to ask and explore these empirically.
Awesome, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question is about, it's maybe a general question about how we can use these advertising-based platforms as features in a prediction model. I'm curious how transparent these companies are about those algorithms and how you use that information in your sort of bias correction approach. For instance, if in a certain country men have like higher spend capacity, maybe they'll be targeted by ads more, even if they're equally represented on a digital platform.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent question again. So we have transparency and actually the fact that these MAU and DAO counts that we get from platforms are opaque is a very significant challenge in this research, right? I mean, they are black box. We don't. So I guess this is a huge challenge for this research. The fact that the underlying algorithms that generate MAU and DAO are opaque. But another challenge is, of course, is that these are data that were created and are served to advertisers, not researchers. So a big challenge is that, for example, we can't go to the past and ask, well, what was the user count, a year ago? That's why we laboriously collect these data every day or regularly, just to make sure that we actually have prospectively data going forward. So these are a number of the sort of operational challenges in doing this type of research. That's also another reason why we're constantly monitoring and validating against essentially high quality survey data, is to try and see to what extent is this. So our setup is to use this as a signal, right? It's not in most of our analysis the outcome of it in of itself. And we do monitor and see how does the signal change over time, and that's something that we're methodologically very interested in as well. But yeah, I think there's been work to try and audit the underlying algorithm. So there's been work done by some of my collaborators where they've been looking at where they run surveys using the target impacts platforms. And then they ask people to report, self-report, for example, location, age, gender, and so on. And then they see how well are those algorithms doing to actually capture those characteristics. And they find that for age and gender, they do very well because those are kind of the most basic things that people generally report when they set up a social media account. But for some things like local geographies, it doesn't do as well, particularly if they're large commuters. So there's been some work trying to audit the algorithms. In a lot of our work, really, age and gender are the two main things we're looking at. This is intentional, we don't go to other more sort of complex behaviors because then we think the algorithm, might be doing things that we actually don't think is either from a measurement perspective, but also from an ethical perspective, reasonable for us to be using. So we're really just in all of this, just using the most sort of age and gender as really the only two things that we're doing. But even then, we're validating against surveys exactly because we don't want to just use that as an outcome of interest.
Firstly, thank you for a really, really fascinating talk. So again, I wanted to ask about this really interesting data set that you found. In fact, that social media companies are it's sort of like a happy coincidence that because they want to provide this data to advertisers, you're able to use this for this really, really crucial research. So my question is, are there other sources of data that you know must be out there, but that aren't accessible to researchers? So I don't know, maybe mobile service providers themselves or something. Are there data sets out there that you feel should be made available to researchers for this sort of work that aren't? And so do you feel optimistic that there might be mechanisms through which they could be made available?
So I think that this data set that we're using, that they're providing to advertisers, I think really social media companies should just provide these data sets without us having to jump through hoops for them. So I mean, because these are aggregate counts on aggregate user counts and also doing this over time. So just to give you an example, these data are, so companies don't do this because they often think this is linked to sort of, business interests and share of the market and so on. So there's a bit of hesitation on that front for sharing them. But I have a number of regular calls with organizations across low and middle income countries who are very interested in knowing, oh, can you tell us a little bit about, we want to run this this program, and we're thinking that maybe Facebook would be a good way for us to do this. Can you tell us something about, who we would reach with these, this, for example, health program or this contraceptive awareness program or sexuality education program. And then I say, well, oh, you can do this on the ad platform. And the ad platform will tell you. And then they're like, can you tell us more about this? Can you tell us about user accounts? How do we move about this? So I guess my point is that then we always do sort of sessions to explain them how the ad platform works. And really, it would be so much easier if companies would just provide information on their user characteristics to people without us having to jump over, also just change over time. So even this data set, I think, should be made available without us having to jump through hoops to collect it through an API. Because there are use cases that I have encountered and I'm constantly supporting, our team is supporting, but we don't feel that we can constantly do this for everyone, right? But I think more broadly, we've entered a world where a lot of APIs have been shut and ready access to different streams of digital trade data are becoming less and less. And so there's a sort of broader shift in this community towards discussing the importance of data donation approaches, as well as other ways in which digital trace and other measures can be incorporated within existing surveys to do again data donation, and I do think that's actually a valuable direction to go, because I do see there's an inherent precarity in these streams of data, and we can't go about being innovators all the time, right? We actually would like to curate data sets that are fit for purpose, and in many cases, not jump through hoops to repurpose other sources. So I'm increasingly concerned about the precarity. I mean, the API model of access is very democratic, it's wonderful, but it also is one that's becoming increasingly precarious. So I think we need to, as a community, have a broader discussion around, well, either we need to make APIs available again, and I don't see that, at least for the moment, there seems to be an environment for that, but then we need to think about, okay, how can we do data donation, survey-based approaches, which are also better from sort of consent perspective, for creating the kinds of data that are fit for purpose with questions we want to ask. Thank you.
Let's do the last one.
Hi there, thank you so much for your talk, on it's so informative. I would love to hear you comment on how you tackle the challenge of local variances of social media adoption. Obviously, there's high localization in some countries like Russia, contacted instead of people using Facebook, and also different platforms having different uses across cultural contexts. For example, like Facebook being a really prevalent source of activism during the Arab Spring, but Twitter being the main source of activism during the Gezi protests in Istanbul. So I'm wondering how you tackle that challenge and whether you incorporate that to your research.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's a really important point, that of course, these are all platforms that we're capturing data on, and you know, the underlying assumption, at least for digital gender gaps, has been that the Facebook gender gap is a good predictor moving forward, and in some cases that's not a good predictor. And we do some analysis looking at where the prediction works well and where it doesn't. But to your point about examining different platforms, we have done work looking at other platforms. So of course, I mentioned a bit that we've done work using LinkedIn, which is a specific type of platform and use case. But we've also, for example, in China, done work using Weibo's marketing platform. So Weibo also provides the same information on users. So we have some work on Weibo for China. We've also done work using AdWords, so Google AdWords and Facebook, and sort of done a comparative analysis of looking at gender gaps on AdWords and Facebook, and trying to see if and how they compare. We've also done work to talk of the Russian case on being contacted. So one application of these data streams that I didn't talk about in this talk is that we were able to repurpose the data collection that we run for digital gender gaps during the Russian invasion of Ukraine for mapping population displacement within Ukraine, because these data were being collected as a part of the setup that we have. But in that case, we also set up collections for Recontact as well, because that also has an advertising platform. So as a general principle, because this is obviously the way that companies make money, they provide this information to advertisers on news accounts, and all platforms have some stream of advertising audience estimates that they do provide, although not always as straightforward to collect as the one provided by Facebook.
Thank you very much. Let's close the Q&A here. Let's thank you again for the fantastic talk.